This is Under the Lens, featuring economic research by Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of Gordon T. Long and is based on facts he feels to be accurate as a result of his research at this time. All listeners are advised to independently verify all research for market changes. The following opinions are not in any way a solicitation for business, nor should they be considered investment advice. You should always consult a registered investment advisor before making investment decisions. Now, let's join Gordon for today's show.
Good morning. It is Monday, September the 23rd, 2013. I'm Gord Long at GordonTLong.com. As is normally the case, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I will pass over some of them quickly and leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's Global Macro Tipping Points Research Report document. The research document this month updates the global risk elements and tipping points. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of the Global Macro Tipping Points Report: the macro, the regional, and the U.S. economic developments. I want to tie them together, though, in a discussion of what I will call the taper caper. There was a lot more going on about the Fed's decision to defer on what is referred to as taper than meets the eye. In that context, I want to discuss the behind-the-scenes developments at the recent G20 meeting in St. Petersburg, Russia, the unfolding emerging markets crisis, what the Fed's taper decision tells us about the current economic situation, and some observations on what I see as a crack-up boom beginning to take shape. The just concluded G20 summit in St. Petersburg sheds light on the seriousness of the concerns surrounding the global economic slowdown, which we have been warning about for some time now. Additionally, it placed a spotlight on the plummeting currencies in the emerging markets, which was occurring prior to the summit, on concerns of the U.S. Federal Reserve's relatively minor plans to begin implementing what is commonly referred to as taper. Away from the glare of the media, however, according to the China Daily, the BRICS cobbled together an emergency $100 billion currency reserve firewall funds. The BRICS were obviously worried. The 1997 Asia crisis taught emerging economies the importance of strong currency reserve positions, an event that hot capital flows became volatile and changed direction. Despite building currency reserves, the BRICS and other emerging markets still felt what was looming would leave them potentially exposed. As the lead BRICS members, China, in this firewall, will inject $41 billion into the firewall fund, and each of Brazil, India, and Russia will ante $18 billion, with South Africa paying the remaining $5 billion. But additionally, urgent side meetings were held separately to finance the BRICS a new development bank, negotiated were its capital structure, membership, shareholders, and governance. It was leaked that the bank will have an additional subscribed capital of $50 billion from the BRICS countries. It would appear there was more urgency to the above discussions than, frankly, the escalating G20 focus on the Syrian conflict. When participating in the main G20 session, it was clear what the BRICS agenda was. Their focus was the impact of the U.S. monetary taper direction and the apparent U.S. disregard for the global consequences. The BRICS' veiled contempt towards U.S. policy was a direct result that since 2008 they have had to fight the hot money flows that accompanied multiple U.S. quantitative easing programs, with resulting rise in currencies hurting exports, creating overdevelopment and inflation pressures, while foreign development investment artificially pushed up bond prices. Now, with the U.S. reversing course, the BRICS felt the backlash as money fled, investments stopped, currencies plummeted, and interest rates rapidly rose. Moreover, the BRICS saw themselves facing serious economic, social and political problems which they felt were not of their making. They saw and still see themselves facing a no-win decision of impose capital controls or let the Fed run your economy. When it came to the central discussion at the G20 regarding Syria, is it any wonder that those most vocal against U.S. intervention were these same countries? They knew Syria just compounded the problem. Frankly, they've lost confidence in American global leadership and policy formulation. Speaking at a final G20 press conference, Russian President Vladimir Putin said, and I quote, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and Italy came out against military actions in Syria, end of quote. You will notice these are the BRIC members and others of what I refer to in my recent writings as the Fragile Four, but more on that later. Putin also said, and again I quote, he was surprised to see that ever more participants in the summit, including the leader of India, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia, were speaking vehemently against a possible military operation in Syria. Putin cited the words of the South African president, Jacob Zuma, who said many countries were feeling unprotected against such actions undertaken by stronger countries. Speaking on behalf of the BRICS, Chinese Vice Minister of Finance, Zhu Guangyanko, said, and I quote, we hope the U.S. will carefully consider its decision to exit its quantitative easing policy to make more contribution to the global economy, end of quote. The G20 were scared stiff of the impact of tapering and made it very clear to President Obama, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and the Federal Reserve Chairman who attend as part of the President's entourage. Message clearly received. Now, switching gears just briefly, we're going to come back to this. There is little doubt the global economy is continuing to slow, whether it's EU unemployment getting worse, Spanish non-performing loans going through the roof and placing even more pressures on the entire Spanish banking sector, Caterpillar warning of sales slowing, and most recently even in its usually unstoppable Latin America mining market, and the list goes on. The peripheral nations of the world, which are dependent on growth in the developed world and the major export centers in Asia of Japan and China, are seeing dramatic slowdown for their export products. As I mentioned, the hot money flows had reversed as a direct consequences of the taper talk, which began in late May and began grabbing investor attention in June. When this happens, the Fragile Five and emerging nations were hit with a reduced wealth effect, an end of low-cost financing, falling currencies, consumer inflation, rising asset prices in local currencies, rising food and shelter costs. All of this brings social unrest and political pressures. With critical elections nearing, there was even more pressure at the G20 to fix the problems and fast, or at least to kick the can down the road one more time. So what happened as a result of the G20 and almost immediately after the entire G20 beat up on the U.S.? What happened were unprecedented political developments, which I'm going to go through, and I'll leave you to decide on what was really going on behind the scenes here. If it hadn't been for these three stunning developments occurring immediately following the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg, the economic unwinding in the emerging markets, which was well underway and rapidly gaining momentum, would have quickly washed ashore in the developed economies. The urgent selling of currency reserves held in U.S. treasuries to stabilize emerging market currencies was swiftly becoming problematic. The resulting rise in the developed economy interest rates, such as U.S. treasuries, was nearing worrying structural levels. The following choreographed news announcements successfully reworked the global calculus, at least temporarily. First, an abrupt reversal in the U.S. imminent attack on Syria by First President Obama's astonishing deferral to Congress, unheard of, and then, just as astoundingly, negotiating a diffusion of the escalating crisis. Secondly, Lawrence Summers' stunning withdrawal of his name from consideration as the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. The emerging markets leaped on news of Summers' withdrawal. Emerging markets hit a 3-month high in the bonds of developing countries climbed by the most since mid-July. All major currencies climbed against the dollar, with those of the emerging markets making the Hungarian forint adding 1%, and the Turkish lira also helped by easing of the tensions over Syria, gaining 1.4% on that news announcement alone. Thirdly, the Federal Reserve's shocking deferral of the initial stages of taper. Unheard of kind of precedent for the Fed to reverse like this. A decision which left Fed and market watchers completely miffed. Global markets again exploded higher, including, and most importantly, the troubled emerging markets. As Bill Gross of PIMCO heralded immediately, the risk-on trade was back on. The results of the announcements were obviously dramatic. And according to a key strategist, Stephen Englander at Citigroup, and I quote, "If there is a pattern, it is that high-yield, high current account deficit currencies have rallied the most and dramatically. Currencies that were hurt the most by fears of liquidity tightening seem to be doing the best." These actions are all signs of how spooked the leaders are of what they are being told by their economic advisors of what's going on in the global economy. It's slowing and slowing rapidly. Unfortunately, none of these actions are going to solve any problems in the longer term. In my estimation, we are now below the event horizon. Let me give you a couple of benchmarks on this. Alistair MacLeod of goldmoney.com has devised a new measure of money which he calls the Fiat money quantity, or FMQ. According to MacLeod, the purpose is to give us a measure of fiat money that enables us to assess the danger of currency hyperinflation. The principle behind it is to signal deviations from the long-term trend of currency growth to alert us to both monetary crisis and excessive inflation. The approach is to unwind the historic progression from full gold convertibility to the current state of no convertibility. The FMQ is therefore comprised of the sum of cash and coin plus all accessible deposits plus our bank's deposits held at the central bank. The dotted line in the chart is the long-term exponential trend rate, and it is immediately obvious that the FMQ is now hyperinflating. It currently requires a $3.6 trillion contraction of deposits to return this measure of currency quantity back to trend. This accurately sums up the problem facing the Fed. We must understand they are in an almost impossible position now that dates back to their monetary response to the banking crisis in 2007-2008. According to MacLeod's estimates, not even Paul Volcker could have got us out of this one. Once the addiction to weak money hits this pace, there is no solution without threatening to bring down the whole system. Here's another assessment. This is one from Barclays Capital. Barclays believes Bernanke's taper actions made it very clear that between financial conditions and the fragility of growth, the U.S. is incapable of surviving without ZIRP and QE, at least for now. Barclays notes ultimately normalization should proceed according to a timeline that does not threaten recovery, yet will result in a neutral monetary policy by the time the economy reaches full capacity and the desired inflation rate. However, there are many uncertainties along this path. Chairman Bernanke has said it might take 2 or 3 years after 2016 to reach a 4% Fed funds rate. The FOMC's longer run expectation is that. But as the disturbing chart shown here highlights, even an adjustment to 2%, the median FOMC expectations for December 2016, entails a formidable adjustment of monetary policy once allowance is made for the tapering of quantitative easing. Given we now know what tapering is tightening, the implicit rate hike from a reduction in quantitative easing means a 600 basis point tightening in financial conditions. Do you believe in miracles? There is a wide variation of economic estimates of the impact of LSAP, but one rule of thumb is that net purchases of $800 billion have very approximately a similar impact on U.S. GDP of a 100 basis point reduction in the Fed funds rate. This implies that the Fed's cumulative LSAP set to approach $3 trillion by Q1 2014 might be considered equivalent to lowering the Fed's funds target by 370 basis points. According to Barclays, they have tried to represent this in terms of negative equivalent Fed funds rate, shown here in this chart, which illustrates that a return to a normality in terms of the Fed's balance sheet and reaching even 2 to 2.5% Fed funds rate would represent a formidable tightening of U.S. monetary conditions. Simply put, how do you think our easy money, share buybacking, leverage at all-time highs corporations will cope with 600 basis points rise in the cost of capital over the next 3 years? There can be little doubt of the magnitude of trap that we're in, and in fact we are below the event horizon. Let me show you a series of graphics I've been using for a long time now. They seem uncanny in spelling out what is unfolding before our eyes. I first drew this chart prior to the 2008 crisis. Despite it going exponential, the chart only goes to 2008, when in fact money and credit then exploded. I show you this just to give you a true perspective of what's going on as they continuously change scales and go to log scales. I drew this chart during the early stages of the 2008 financial crisis as the housing bubble was imploding. As you can see by the detail on the right, we were watching housing closely, but we were looking at what it all meant and what we were expecting would occur as a result as you go around this circle. Today it seems pretty accurate, especially when you consider Abenomics being launched in Japan in Q1 and the state and local failures beginning right across the country, but most evidently as witnessed recently in Detroit. This chart laid out the expected cascading sequence from financial to economic to political concerns. Additionally, it shows the type of instruments I felt would fail and the timeline that went with them. You'll notice we still have a 700 trillion swaps and a 71 trillion shadow banking problem, which is yet to be addressed in any fashion. Dodd-Frank's solutions have been so watered down as to be unrecognizable as any serious changes, and the problems have obviously got worse. These are the key words from the previous crisis, and the key words that I expect to become common in the media during the next crisis, a crisis that is getting closer at hand. I presently see it arriving sometime in mid-2014. There's always the possibility that desperate politicians and creative central banks can still push it out further. The inevitability of what is coming cannot. I've laid out in some detail in this month's Trigger webzine, which is about to be released, the clear signs of what all this is leading up to. It is leading to a von Mises-style crack-up boom, in my opinion. To me, we have an almost textbook case unfolding. I show clearly the early warning examples such as Venezuela with exploding equities, Argentina, India with gold restrictions significantly now in place, Turkey, Poland recently seizing all pension plans, technical charts that bear this out, precious metals charts that bear this out in long-term monthly and weekly charts with appropriate technical analysis overlaid on it. Every day I see more telltale. But I don't pretend to yet fully understand exactly how this will all unfold. But there are some pretty clear stages that can be expected and which we are presently witnessing. Inflation, masked, hidden, manipulated, but nevertheless present. Subsequently, financial repression, which we clearly have, is represented with negative real interest rates and crushing of savings on a protracted basis. Reduction of personal freedoms, hoarding and increasing value of precious metals, currency, and I'm talking about physical, not paper here, currency debasement and devaluation, central government control and statism. I try and post these on a daily basis on the Tipping Points page on our site. Be aware, we are still in the early stages, but it is going to be quite a ride. So as the sign above my dentist chair advises, sit down, strap up, and hold on. In closing, I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a very knowledgeable and well-informed professional financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2013 be an outstanding investment year for you. Thank you very much for listening.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at